Acres of Diamonds by Russell H. Conwell, Part 7. 4. His Power as Orator and Preacher. Even as a young man, Conwell won local fame as an orator. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he began making patriotic speeches that gained enlistments. After going to the front, he was sent back home for a time on furlough to make more speeches and draw more recruits. For his speeches were so persuasive, so powerful, so full of homely and patriotic feeling that the men who heard them thronged into the ranks. And as a preacher, he uses persuasion power, simple and homely eloquence to draw men to the ranks of Christianity. He is an orator born, and he has developed this inborn power by the hardest of study and thought and practice. He is one of those rare men who always seize and hold the attention. When he speaks, men listen. It is quality, temperament, control. The word is immaterial, but the fact is very material indeed. Some quarter of a century ago, Conwell published a little book for students on the study and practice of oratory. That clear-cut articulation is the charm of eloquence, is one of his insisted-upon statements, and it well illustrates his lifelong practice of the man himself. For every word as he talks can be heard in every part of a large building, yet he always speaks without apparent effort. He avoids elocution. His voice is soft-pitched and never breaks, even now when he is over 70, because, as he explains it, he always speaks in his natural voice. There is never a straining after effect. A speaker must possess a large-hearted regard for the welfare of his audience, he writes, and here again we see Conwell explaining Conwellism. Enthusiasm invites enthusiasm is another of his points of importance, and one understands that it is by deliberate purpose and not by chance that he tries with such tremendous effort to put enthusiasm into the hearers with every sermon and every lecture that he delivers. It is easy to raise a laugh, but dangerous, for it is the greatest test of an orator's control of his audience to be able to land them again on solid earth of sober thinking. I have known him, at the very end of a sermon, to have a ripple of laughter sweep over the entire congregation, and then in a moment he has every individual under his control listening soberly to his words. He never fears to use humor, and it is always very simple and obvious and effective. With him, even a very simple pun may be used, not only without taking away from the strength of what he is saying, but with a vivid increase of impressiveness. And when he says something funny, it is such a delightful and confidential way, with such a genial, quiet, infectious humorousness that his audience is captivated, and they never think that he is telling something funny of his own. It seems, such is the skill of the man, that he is just letting them know of something humorous, that they can enjoy it with him. Be absolutely truthful and scrupulously clear, he writes, and with delightful, terse common sense, he says, use illustrations that illustrate. And never did an orator live up to this injunction more than does Conwell himself. Nothing is more surprising, nothing is more interesting than the way in which he makes use of illustrations of the impressions and incidences of his long and varied life. And whatever it is, it has direct and instant bearing upon the progress of his discourse. He will refer to something that he heard a child say in a train yesterday. In a few minutes he will speak of something that he saw, or someone whom he met last month or last year or 10 years ago in Ohio, in California, in London, in Paris, in New York, in Bombay. And each memory, each illustration, is a hammer with which he drives home a truth. The vast number of places he has visited and people he has met, the infinite variety of things his observant eyes have seen, give him his ceaseless flow of illustrations, and his memory and his skill make admirable use of them. It is seldom that he uses an illustration from what he has read. Everything is characteristically his own. Henry M. Stanley, who knew him well, referred to him as that double-sided Yankee who could see at a glance all that there is and all there ever was. And never was there a man who supplements with personal reminiscence the place or the person that has figured in the illustration. When he illustrates with a story of the discovery of California gold at Sutter's, He almost parenthetically remarks, "I delivered this lecture on that very spot a few years ago, that is, in the town that arose on that very spot." And when he illustrates by the story of the invention of the sewing machine, he adds, "I suppose that if any of you were asked who was the inventor of the sewing machine, you would say that it is Elias Howe. But that would be a mistake. I was with Elias Howe in the Civil War, and he often used to tell me how he had tried for 14 years to invent the sewing machine, and then his wife, feeling that something really had to be done, invented it in a couple hours." Listening to him, you begin to feel in touch with everybody and everything, and in a friendly and intimate way. Always, whether in the pulpit or on the platform, as in private conversation, there is an absolute simplicity about the man and his words, a simplicity and earnestness, a complete honesty. And when he sits down in his book on oratory, no man has the right to use words carelessly. He stands for that respect for word craftsmanship that every successful speaker or writer must feel. "Be intensely in earnest," he writes. And in writing this, he sets down a prime principle not only of his oratory, but of his life. A young minister told me that Dr. Conwell once said to him with deep feeling, "Always remember as you preach that you are striving to save at least one soul with every sermon." And to one of his close friends, Dr. Conwell said, in one of his self-revealing conversations, "I feel whenever I preach that there is always one person in the congregation to whom, in all probability, I shall never preach again, and therefore I feel that I must exert my utmost power in that last chance." And in this, even if this were all, one sees why each sermon is so impressive, and why his energy never lags. Always with him is the feeling that he is in this world to do all the good he possibly can do. Not a moment, not an opportunity must be lost. The moment he rises and steps in front of his pulpit, he has the attention of everyone in the building, and this attention he closely holds till he is through. Yet it is never by a striking effort that attention is gained, except in so far that his utter simplicity is striking. I want to preach so simply that you will not think of it as preaching, but you will think of it as listening to a friend. I remember him saying one Sunday morning as he began his sermon, and then he went on, just as such homely, kindly, friendly words promised, and how efficiently. He believes that everything should be put as to be understood by all, and this belief applies not only to his preaching, but to the reading of the Bible, whose description he not only visualizes to himself, but makes vividly clear to his hearers, and often makes fascination in result. For example, he is reading the 10th chapter of 1 Samuel. He begins, "Thou shalt meet the company of prophets." Singers, it should be translated. He puts in, lifting his eyes from the page and looking out over his people. Then he goes on, taking this change as a matter of course. "Thou shalt meet a company of singers coming down from the high place." Whereupon he again interrupts himself, and in irresistible explanatory aside, which instantly raises the desired picture in the mind of everyone, he says, "That means from the little old church on the hill, you know." And how plain and clear and real and interesting, most of all interesting, it is from this moment. Another man would have left it at the prophets coming down from the high place, which would not have seemed at all alive or natural. And here suddenly Conwell has flashed his picture of the singers coming down from the little old church on the hill. There is a magic in doing that sort of thing. And he goes on reading, "Thou shalt meet a company of singers coming down from that little old church on the hill, with a psaltery and a tabret and a pipe and a harp, and they shall sing." Music is one of Conwell's strongest aids. He sings himself. He sings as if he likes to sing, and often finds himself leading the singing, usually so indeed at the prayer meetings, and often in effect at the church services. I remember at one church service that the choir leader was standing in front of the massed choir, ostensibly leading the singing, but Conwell himself standing at the rear of the pulpit platform, with his eyes on the hymn book, silently swaying a little from the music and unconsciously beating time as he swayed, was just as unconsciously the real leader, for it was he whom the congregation was watching, and with them they were keeping time. He never suspected it. He was merely thinking along with the music. and there was such a look of contagious happiness on his face as he made everyone in the building similarly happy, for he possesses a mysterious faculty in imbuing others with his own happiness. Not only singers, but the modern equivalent of psaltery and tabret and cymbals all have their place in Dr. Conwell's scheme of a church service, for there may be a piano, and there may even be a trombone, and there is a giant organ to help the voices, and at times there are chiming bells. His musical taste seems to tend toward the thunderous, or perhaps that is how he knows that there are times when people like to hear thunderous and are moved by it, and how the choir themselves like it. They occupy a great curving space behind the pulpit and put their hearts into song, and as the congregation disperses and the choir filters down, sometimes they are still singing, and some of them continue to sing as they go slowly out toward the doors. They are happy. Conwell himself is happy. All the congregation is happy. He makes everybody feel happy in coming to church. He makes the church attractive, just as Howells was so long ago told that he did in Lexington. And there is something more than happiness. There is a sense of ease, of comfort, of general joy that is quite unmistakable. There is nothing of stiffness or constraint, and with it all there is full reverence. It is no wonder that he is accustomed to fill every seat of that great building. His gestures are usually very simple. Now and then, when he works up to an emphasis, he strikes one fist in the palm of the other hand. When he is through, you do not remember that he has made any gestures at all, but the sound of his voice remains with you, and the look of his wonderful eyes. And though he has passed the 70 he looks out over his people with eyes that still have the varied look of youth. Like all great men, he not only does big things, but keeps in touch with myriad details. When his assistants announcing the funeral of an old member hesitates about the street and number, and says that they can be found in the telephone directory, Dr. Conwell's voice breaks quietly in with such a number, giving it Dauphin Street, quietly and in a low tone, yet everyone in the church hears distinctively every syllable of that low voice. His fund of personal anecdote or personal reminiscence is constant and illustrative of his preaching, just as it is when he lectures, and the reminiscences sweep through many years, and at times are really startling in the vivid and homelike pictures they present of the famous folk of the past that he knew. One Sunday evening, he made an almost casual reference to the one time he first met Garfield, then a candidate for the presidency. I asked Major McKinley, who I had met in Washington and whose home was in northern Ohio, as was that of Mr. Garfield, to go with me to Mr. Garfield's home and introduce me. When we got there, a neighbor had to find him. Jim, he called. You see, Garfield was just plain old Jim to his neighbors. It's hard to recognize a hero over your back fence. He paused a moment for the appreciative ripple to subside, and went on. We three talked together. What a rare talking it must have been, McKinley, Garfield, and Conwell. We talked together, and after a while we got to the subject of hymns, and those two great men both told me of how deeply they loved the old hymn, the old-time religion. Garfield especially loved it. So he told us, because the good old man who brought him up as a boy and to whom he owed such gratitude used to sing it at the pasture bars outside of the boys' window every morning. And young Jim knew, whenever he heard that old tune, that it meant it was time for him to get up. He said that he had heard the best concerts and the finest operas in the world, but had never heard anything he loved as he still loved the old-time religion. I forgot what a reason there was for McKinley's especially liking it, but he, as Garfield, liked it immensely. What followed was a striking example of Conwell's intentness on losing no chance to fix an impression in the hearer's mind, and at the same time it was really an astounding proof of his power to move and sway, for a new expression came over his face, and he said, as if the idea had only at that moment occurred to him, as it most probably had, I think it's in our hymnal. And in a moment he announced the number, and the great organ struck, and every person in the great church, every man, woman, and child, joined in the swinging rhythm of verse after verse. as they could never tire of the old-time religion. It is a simple melody, more than a single line of almost monotone music. It was good enough for Mother, and it's good enough for me. It was good enough on the fiery furnace, and it's good enough for me. Thus it went on, with never wearying iteration, each time with the refrain more and more rhythmic and swaying. The old-time religion, the old-time religion, the old-time religion, it's good enough for me. That it was good enough for the Hebrew children, that it was good enough for Paul and Silas, that it will help you when you're dying, and it will show you the way to heaven. All these and still other lines were sung with a sort of wailing softness, a curious monotone, a depth of earnestness. And the man who had worked this miracle of control, by evoking out of the past his memory of a meeting with two of the vanished great ones of the earth, stood before his people, leading them, singing with them, his eyes aglow with an inward light. His magic had suddenly set them upon the spirit of the old camp-meeting days, the days of pioneering and hardship when religion meant so much to everybody, and even those who knew nothing of such things felt them, even if but vaguely. Every heart was moved and touched, and every old tune will sing in the memory of all who heard it and sung it as long as they live. End of Part 7. Acres of Diamonds by Russell H. Conwell, Part 8. 5. Gift for Inspiring Others. The constant earnestness of Conwell, his desires to let no chance slip by of helping a fellow man, puts often into his voice, when he preaches, a note of eagerness, of anxiety. But when he prays, when he turns to God, his manner undergoes a subtle and unconscious change. A load has slipped off his shoulders and has been assumed by a higher power. Into his bearing, dignified though it was, there comes an unconscious increase of the dignity. Into his voice, firm as it were before, there comes a deeper note of firmness. He is apt to fling his arms widespread as he prays, in a fine gesture that he never uses at other times. And he looks upward with the dignity of a man who is talking to a higher being, is proud of being friend and confidant. One does not need to be a Christian to appreciate the beauty and fineness of Conwell's prayers. He is likely at any time to do the unexpected, and he is so great a man, and he has such control that whatever he does seems to everybody a perfectly natural thing. His sincerity is so evident, and whatever he does is done so simply and naturally that it is just a matter of course. I remember during one church service, while the singing was going on, that he suddenly rose from his chair and, kneeling beside it on the open pulpit with his back to the congregation, remained in that posture for several minutes. No one thought it strange. I was likely enough the only one who noticed it. His people are used to his sincerities, and at the time it was merely that he had a few words to say quietly to God, and turned aside for a few moments to say them. His earnestness of belief in prayer makes him a firm believer in the answers to prayer, and in fact to what may be termed the direct interposition of Providence. Doubtless the mystic strain inherited from his mother also has much to do with this. He has a typically homely way of expressing it by one of his favorite maxims, one that he loves to repeat encouragingly to friends who are in difficulties themselves, or who know of the difficulties that are his. And this hardening maxim is, trust in God and do the next thing. At one time in the early days of his church work in Philadelphia, a payment of $1,000 was absolutely needed to prevent a lawsuit in regard to a debt for the church organ. In fact, it was worse than a debt. It was a note signed by himself personally that had become due. He was always ready to assume personal responsibilities for debts of his church, and failure to meet the note would meet a measure of disgrace as well as marked church discouragement. He had tried all the sources that seemed open to him, but in vain. He could not openly appeal to the church members in this case, for it was in the early days of his pastorate, and his zeal for the organ, his desire for determination to have it, as a necessary part of the church equipment, had outrun the judgment of some of his best friends, including that of the deacon who had gone to Massachusetts for him. They had urged a delay till other expenses were met, and he had acted against their advice. He had tried such friends as he could, and had tried prayer, but there was no sign of aid, whether supernatural or natural. And again, literally on the very day which the holder of the note was to begin proceedings against him, a check precisely for the needed $1,000 came to him by mail from a man in the West, a man who was a total stranger to him. It turned out that the man's sister, who was one of the temple membership, had written to her brother of Dr. Conwell's work. She knew nothing of any special need for money, knew nothing whatever of any note or of the demand for $1,000. She merely outlined to her brother what Dr. Conwell was accomplishing, and with such enthusiasm that the brother at once sent the opportune check. At a later time, the sum of $10,000 was importantly needed. It was due. Payment had been promised. It was for some of the construction work of the Temple University buildings. The last day had come, and Conwell and the very few who knew of the emergencies were in the depth of gloom. It was too large a sum to ask the church people to make up, for they were not rich, and they had already been giving splendidly of their slender means for the church and then for the university. There was no rich man to turn to. The men famous for enormous charitable gifts have never let themselves be interested in any of the work of Russell Conwell. It would be unkind and gratuitous to suggest that it is because their names could not be personally attached, or because the work of an unpretentious kind among unpretentious people. It need merely be said that neither they nor their agents have carried to aid, except that one of the very richest, whose name is the most distinguished in the entire world as a giver, did once, in response to a strong personal application, give $3,500, this being the extent of the association of the wealthy that any of the varied Conwell work. So when it absolutely necessary to have $10,000, the possibilities of money had been exhausted, whether from congregation or individuals. Russell Conwell, in spite of his superb optimism, is also a man of deep depressions, and this is because of the very fire and fervor of his nature, for always in such a nature there is a balancing. He believes in success. Success must come. Success in itself, almost a religion with him. Success for himself and for all the world who will try for it. But there are times when he is sad and doubtful over some particular possibilities. And he immensely believes in prayer. Faith can move mountains, but always he believes that it is better not to wait for the mountains thus to be moved, but to go right out and get to work at moving them. And once in a while there comes a time when the mountain looms too threatening, even after the bravest efforts and the deepest trust. Such a time has come. The $10,000 debt was a looming mountain that he tried in vain to move. He could still pray, and he did, but it was one of the times when he could only think that something had gone wrong. The dean of the university, who has been closely in touch with all of his work for many years, told me of how in a discouragement, which was more notable through contrast with his usual unfailing courage, he left the executive offices for his home a couple of blocks away. He went away with everything looking dark before him. It was Christmas time, but the very fact it being Christmas only added to his depression. Christmas was such an unnatural time for unhappiness. But in a few minutes he came flying back, radiant, overjoyed, sparkling with happiness, waving a slip of paper in his hand, which was a check for precisely $10,000. For it had just been drawn out of an envelope handed to him as he reached home by the mail carrier. And it has come so strangely and so naturally, for the check was from a woman who was profoundly interested in his work, and who had sent the check knowing that in a general way it was needed, but without the least idea that there was any immediate need. That was 8 or 9 years ago, but although the donor was told of the time that Dr. Conwell and all of us were most grateful for the gift, it was not until very recently that she was told of how opportune it was and the change it made in Dr. Conwell. For he is a great man for maxims, and all of us who are associated with him know that one of his favorites is that it will all come out right sometime. And of course, we had a rare opportunity to tell him that he ought never be discouraged, for it is seldom that he is. When the big new church building, the members of the church were vaguely disturbed by noticing, when the structure reached the second story, that at its height, on one side toward the vacant and undoubt land adjoining, there were several doors built that opened literally into nothing but space. When asked about those doors and their purpose, Dr. Conwell would make some casual reply, generally to the effect that they might be excellent as fire escapes. To no one for quite a while did he broach even a hint of the greatest plan that was something on his mind, which was that the buildings of the university some day would stand on the land immediately joining the church. And at that time, the university, the Temple University as it is now called, was not even a college. Although it was probably called a college, Conwell had organized it, and it consisted of a number of classes and teachers meeting in highly inadequate quarters in two little houses. But the imagination of Conwell early pictured great new buildings with accommodations for thousands. At the time the dream was realized, the imagination became a fact, and now those second-floor doors actually open from the Temple Church into the Temple University. You see, he always thinks big. He dreams big dreams and wins big success. All his life he has talked and preached success, and it is very real and a very practical belief with him that it is just as easy to do a large thing as a small one, and in fact a little easier. And so he naturally does not see why one should be satisfied with the small things in life. If your rooms are big and the people will come and fill them, he likes to say, the same effort that wins small success would rightly directed have won a great success. Think big things and then do them. Most favorite of all maxims with this man of maxims is, let patients have their perfect work. Over and over he loves to say it, and his friends laugh about his love for it, and he knows that they will do and laughs about it himself. I tire them all, he says, for they hear me say it every day. But he says it every day because it means so much to him. It stands in his mind as a constant warning against anger and impatience or overhaste, faults to which his impetuous temperament is prone, though few have ever seen him either angry or impatient or hasty. So well does he exercise self-control. Those who have long known him well have said to me that they have never heard him censure anyone, that his forbearance and kindness are wonderful. He is a sensitive man beneath his composure. He has suffered and keenly when he has been unjustly attacked. He feels pain of that sort for a long time, too, for even the passing of the years does not entirely deaden it. When I have been hurt, or when I have talked with annoying cranks, I have tried to let patients have their perfect work, for those very people who have patience with them may afterward be of help. And he went on to talk a little of his early years in Philadelphia, and he said with sadness that it had pained him to meet with opposition, and it had even come from ministers of his own denomination, for he had been so misunderstood and misjudged. But he added, the momentary somberness feeling, even his bitter enemies, had been won over with patience. I could understand a good deal of what he meant, for one of the Baptist ministers of Philadelphia had said to me, with some shame, that at first he actually used to be the case that when Dr. Conwell would enter one of the regular ministers' meeting, all would hold aloof, not a single one stepping forward to meet or greet him. And it was through our jealousy of his success, said the minister vehemently. He has come to this city a stranger and has won instant popularity, and we couldn't stand it. So we pounced upon things that he did that were altogether unimportant. The rest of us were so jealous of his winning throngs that we wouldn't see the good in him, and it hurt Dr. Conwell so much that for 10 years he did not come to our conferences. But all this was changed long ago. Now no minister is so welcomed as he is, and I don't believe that there has ever been a single time since he started coming again that he has not been asked to say something to us. We got over our jealousy long ago, and we all love him. Nor is it only that the clergymen of his own denomination admire him. Not long ago, such having been Dr. Conwell's triumph in the city of his adoption, that the rector of the most powerful and aristocratic church in Philadelphia voluntarily paid lofty tribute to his aims and ability, his work, and his personal worth. He is an inspiration to his brothers in the ministry of Jesus Christ. So this Episcopalian lector wrote, "For he is a friend of all that is good and a foe that is all of evil, a strength to the weak, a comforter to the sorrowing, a man of God." These words came from the heart of one who loves, honors, and reverences him for his character and his deeds. Dr. Conwell did some beautiful and unusual things in his church, instituted some beautiful and unusual customs, and one can see how narrow and hasty criticism charged him long ago with sensationalism. Charges long since forgotten, except through the hurt still felt by Dr. Conwell himself. They used to charge me with making a circus of the church, as if it were possible for me to make a circus of the church, and his tone was one that grieved amusement after all these years. But he was original and he was popular, and therefore there were misunderstandings and jealousy. His Easter services, for example, years ago, became widely talked of and eagerly anticipated, because each sermon would be wrought around some fine symbol, and he would hold in his hand, in the pulpit, a blue robin's egg, or a white dove, or a stem of lilies, or whatever he had chosen as the particular symbol for the particular sermon. And that symbol would give him the central thought of his discourse, accented as it would be by the actual symbol itself in view of the congregation. The cross lighted by electricity, to shine down over the baptismal pool, the little stream of water cascading gently down the steps of the pool during the baptismal rite, the flowers floating in the pool, and his gift of one of them to each of the baptized, as he or she left the water. All things did seem long ago so unconventional, yet his own people recognized the beauty and poetry of them, and thousands of Bibles in Philadelphia have a baptismal rose from Dr. Conwell pressed within the pages. His constant individuality of mind, his constant freshness, alertness, brilliancy, warmth, sympathy endear him to the congregation, and when he returns from an absence they bubble with effervescence over him as if he were some brilliant new preacher who had just come to them. He is always new to them. Were it not that he possesses some unremarkable quality of charm, he would long ago have become, so to speak, an old story. But instead of that, he is to them always a new story, an always entertaining and delightful story after all these years. That it is not only that they still throng to hear him either preach or lecture, though that himself would be noticeable, but it is the delightful and delighted spirit with which they do it. Just the other evening I heard him lecture in his own church, and just after his return from an absence, and every face beamed happily up to him to welcome him back home, and everyone listened so intently to his every word, as if he had never been heard before. And when the lecture was over, a large bouquet of flowers was handed up to him, and someone embarrassedly said a few words about its being because he was home again. It was all that he had just returned from an absence of months, and he had just been away 5.5 days. End of Part 8.